Tonight, sit back, relax, and let your mind drift into a world shaped by shadows, migrations, and forgotten kingdoms. Because the story of the Goths does not begin with fire and war, but with silence in ancient northern silence, where the wind moves across dark waters, and the earliest Gothic families watched the horizon as though it carried secrets meant only for them. Some historians believe their roots lie somewhere near the Baltic, perhaps on the island of Gotland itself, where dense forests pressed in from every side and the sea whispered old myths along the rocky shoreline. Others suggest a more complex origin, scattered across northern Europe in a patchwork of clans, who slowly grew into one of the most influential peoples of late antiquity. But wherever they began, the Goths emerged as a people shaped by cold landscapes, communal resilience, and a way of life built on loyalty to kin, to chieftains, and to the shifting world around them. Imagine the sound of early Gothic settlements, wooden halls creaking in the winter winds, iron tools ringing against timber as morning fires crackled through the mist, and voices echoing across frozen fields where families told stories of distant lands that no one had yet seen. These early generations lived in quiet continuity, but within that quiet, something was growing: an identity, a culture, a momentum that would one day sweep them across the map of Europe. Archaeologists speak of burial goods, brooches, carved combs, objects that hint at a rising ambition, while linguists trace the earliest threads of the Gothic language, a tongue that rolled with sharp consonants like footsteps on frost. And yet, even here, at the beginning, there is mystery. Were these people preparing for a great migration? Or did the migration happen to them pushed by forces beyond the forests, beyond the horizon, beyond anything they could see? The truth remains suspended, somewhere between myth and evidence. And tonight we let that uncertainty guide us deeper into their world. Because the story of the Goths is filled with moments where history almost speaks, but not quite, where the clues are clear, but the meaning remains just a little out of reach. And as we drift from this northern cradle toward the long road ahead, one question lingers softly in the air. What was it that first set the Goths in motion? And who, or what, awaited them beyond the tree line? From the quiet edges of the Roman world, we now move deeper into the shifting landscape that shaped the Goths long before their name, echoed through the halls of collapsing empires. Imagine the cold wind blowing across the vast Pontic steppe, a place where the horizon felt endless and the seasons arrived like ancient judges. Here, among open grasslands and low forests, the Gothic ancestors formed their identity not through sudden conquest, but through centuries of quiet adaptation. Some researchers believe their earliest migrations began around the Baltic shores, where dense pine forests whispered with the sound of distant waves. Others suggest they were always a people in motion, traveling along the widespreading trade routes that connected northern Europe to the Black Sea. Whatever their origin, the clues point toward a slow transformation, a long weaving of culture and memory, shaped by wanderings that brought them into contact with traders, warriors, and storytellers from distant lands. Sit back, relax, and picture the rough wooden shields, the woolen cloaks heavy with morning frost, the low crackle of fires where families shared stories of gods, ancestors, and omens. This was a world where survival required cooperation, and where unity, something the Goths would later wield with frightening strength, was born from necessity. From one generation to the next, they learned the art of negotiating with neighbors, forming alliances, and guarding their identity even as they absorbed influences from outside. Some theories suggest they encountered early steppe nomads, learning from them the importance of swift movement and flexible warfare. Others point to their interactions with the world of Roman merchants, who brought glass, wine, and unfamiliar luxuries across the frontier. The Goths watched carefully, absorbing what they needed, discarding what they didn't, all while maintaining the quiet resilience that defined them. As centuries passed, minor leaders evolved into chieftains, and clans shaped themselves into something resembling a budding nation. Their stories carried by memory rather than written words told of seas crossed, lands won, and struggles survived. These whispered traditions gave the Goths a sense of destiny, a belief that their path, though uncertain, was guided by ancient forces older than Rome herself. And just beyond their awareness, history was moving toward a collision that would reshape their world forever. For now, though, they remained a people suspended between forest and steppe, between myth and reality, not yet aware that they were drifting toward the shadow of an empire whose fate was already beginning to tremble. But the winds were changing, and in those winds, the future of the Goths was slowly gathering its momentum, waiting for the moment when their story would erupt into the heart of Rome's unraveling world. As we move further into the unfolding Gothic story, the landscape shifts once more, pulling us toward the moment when these wandering tribes first came into the clear view of Roma, moment when myths stepped into written history. Sit back, relax, and imagine the 3rd century, a time when the Roman Empire stretched like a great stone ring around the Mediterranean, confident yet beginning to tremble beneath the weight of its own size. Beyond its northern frontier, the Goths were gathering, not as a single unified nation, but as a constellation of clans drawn together by shared roots, shared danger, and the quiet pull of opportunity. Roman writers, observing from fortified outposts along the Danube, described them with a mixture of fear and fascination. Stern-faced warriors with long hair, oval shields, and a fierce reputation for loyalty within their ranks. Some scholars believe the pressure of overcrowding and changing climates nudged the Goths southward, while others suggest that trade with Roman merchants created a gravitational pull that slowly drew them closer to the empire's borders. Whatever the cause, their arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by contact, conflict, and curiosity. Picture the Danube River at dusk, its waters reflecting the fading light as Roman patrol boats glide silently through the current. On the far bank, Gothic camps flicker with firelight, their tents arranged in loose clusters, their horses tethered near the tree line. Between these two worlds lies a delicate balance, part trade, part tension, part unspoken understanding that both sides are watching, waiting, assessing. The Goths, for all their rugged independence, were not immune to the allure of Roman goods, metalwork, fine textiles, and, most importantly, weapons. Some researchers suggest these exchanges were peaceful at first, little more than frontier commerce carried out with caution. Others believe early skirmishes already foreshadowed the storms to come. Over time, this contact reshaped Gothic society. Leaders who could negotiate with Rome gained prestige. Warriors who returned with Roman armor wore it like symbols of power. Even ideas, religious, political, and cultural, began to drift across the river, carried not by armies, but by conversation and curiosity. Yet beneath this quiet fusion, something darker stirred. Rome, stretched thin by wars on multiple fronts, saw the Goths as both a tool and a threat. The Goths, increasingly aware of Rome's vulnerabilities, felt the old winds of ambition shifting. And somewhere between the camps and the forts, between the river and the steppe, destiny began to tighten its grip. For the peaceful frontier would not stay peaceful forever, and the next movements in this story would send shockwaves through both Gothic villages and Roman cities, setting the stage for a century of upheaval. From this fragile frontier between Gothic ambition and Roman authority, we now drift into a period where the Goths began to test the boundaries of an empire that had once seemed unshakable. Sit back, relax, and imagine the tension building like a slow, distant rumble as small raids, shifting alliances, and subtle provocations started to reshape the relationship between the two powers. Some historians believe that these early incursions were less about conquest and more about survival driven by harsh winters, scarcity of land, or competition from neighboring tribes. Others suggest that the Goths recognized an opportunity as Rome struggled with internal crises, rebellions, and rapid changes in leadership. Whatever the cause, the Goths' presence along the Danube grew bolder, and Rome, once confident in its ability to intimidate any foe, found itself forced to negotiate, pacify, or retaliate. Picture a chill morning along the river, where Roman scouts observe Gothic warriors riding effortlessly across frost-covered fields, their horses' hooves muffled by the frozen earth. These warriors were not yet the sweeping conquerors they would later become, but their mobility, unity, and fierce discipline made them a growing force. Their leaders, men such as Ostrogotha, Cianova, and later Fritagon, began to experiment with new strategies, testing Roman defenses, learning from Roman counterattacks, and adapting with each encounter. Some researchers propose that these Gothic leaders understood Rome better than Rome understood them, seeing its wealth not just as a temptation, but as a weakness, a pressure point waiting to be pressed. As the 3rd century unfolded, these tensions erupted into full-scale conflict. The Gothic Wars, though often overlooked in grand narratives of Roman history, marked a turning point where the empire faced an enemy capable of penetrating deeper and striking harder than previous northern threats. We can imagine the chaos as Gothic forces crossed the Danube in coordinated waves, targeting Roman cities in the Balkans, overwhelming garrisons, and seizing plunder that further strengthened their rising power. Some Roman writers, shaken by their losses, described the Goths as a storm sweeping across the frontier, unpredictable and unstoppable. But amidst the destruction, a different influence began to take root. Rome's culture flowing into Gothic life in ways neither side fully anticipated. Captive artisans, merchants, and diplomats carried with them new languages, new beliefs, and new ideas. These quiet exchanges subtly reshaped Gothic identity even as the conflict raged around them. Yet for all this cultural blending, one truth lingered. The Goths had caught the scent of Roman weakness, and Rome had begun to fear a people it could no longer easily contain. And as we move deeper into their story, this fear would soon be justified in ways the empire had never before imagined. From the smouldering edges of these early battles, we now move toward a turning point that would reshape not only the Goths, but the entire Roman world. The moment when the Goths, once raiders and frontier shadows, began transforming into something far greater. Sit back, relax, and imagine the quiet aftermath of war, charred frontier towns, abandoned Roman watchtowers, and Gothic warriors carrying away spoils that whispered of a civilization more vast and complex than anything they had previously known. In these years of shifting power, the Goths found themselves evolving, absorbing new tactics, new weapons, and new visions of what their future could become. Some historians suggest that, through battle, they learned Rome's vulnerabilities, how its armies, though disciplined, were overextended, how its generals, though brilliant, were often constrained by distant emperors, and how its people, though numerous, were no longer united by a single, unshakable purpose. Others believed the Goths were influenced by the prisoners they captured, engineers who knew how to build fortifications, craftsmen who understood metalwork at a finer level, and scholars who carried fragments of Roman law, belief, and strategy. Picture a Gothic chieftain's hall during this era, long wooden beams overhead, firelight flickering across iron weapons, and the murmur of discussions about new lands, new threats, and new possibilities. Leaders such as Siennever had already demonstrated that Rome could be defeated, Devon humbled. Stories of victories spread through Gothic camps like sparks catching dry grass, igniting a sense of confidence that would define the next generation. Yet this transformation was not merely military. Cultural shifts began to ripple through Gothic society as well. Some Gothic families adopted Roman clothing or jewelry brought back from raids. Some warriors forged alliances with Roman officials, trading loyalty for gold or political favor. A few even served as auxiliary troops, learning firsthand the formations and strategies they would someday use against their former employers. Still, beneath these layers of adaptation, the core of Gothic identity remained intact: their devotion to kinship, their reverence for ancestral memory, their belief that strength came from unity and purpose. But the world around them was changing with accelerating speed. Across the eastern horizon, new forces were rising, forces that neither the Goths nor the Romans were prepared to face. Whispers began to spread of distant horsemen, relentless and swift, displacing tribes and swallowing whole kingdoms in their advance. These rumors drifted into Gothic councils like an unwelcome wind, chilling the mood and hinting that their greatest test was yet to come. And as this new threat approached, the Goths would be forced into decisions that would drive them straight toward the heart of Roman territory, forever altering the destiny of both civilizations. From the uneasy calm that followed their early victories, we now step into the gathering storm that would push the Goths toward the most desperate crossroads in their history. Sit back, relax, and imagine the vast plains stretching beyond the Black Sea open, silent and trembling with the pulse of approaching hooves. This was the late 4th century, a time when the world itself seemed to shift, as if some invisible force were rearranging entire peoples like pieces on a board. It was here that the Goths first felt the pressure of a new power rising from the far reaches of Central Asia, the Huns. Some researchers describe the Huns as ghostly riders appearing out of the horizon, swift, ruthless, and almost impossible to predict. Others believe they were less mysterious and more strategic, a confederation of warlike groups forged together by hunger, ambition, and the need to find new lands. Whatever the truth, their arrival crashed into Gothic life like a tidal wave. Picture the moment when Gothic scouts returned to their villages, breathless, describing mounted warriors who moved with uncanny speed, who fought with composite bows that whistled death from a distance, and who swept across the steppe with a ferocity unmatched by earlier foes. Panic spread through the Gothic ranks, not from cowardice, but from the realization that this enemy did not negotiate, did not delay, and did not stop. Some Gothic clans fought back, attempting to form defensive lines along rivers and forests. Others fled, abandoning ancestral lands in hopes of finding refuge elsewhere. And slowly, inevitably, a decision began to form. they would turn to the Roman Empire, the very power they had raided and resisted for generations, not as enemies, but as desperate supplicants. Imagine the long columns of Gothic families, wagons creaking under the weight of possessions, elders guiding children along muddy paths, warriors scanning the horizon with wary eyes. They moved southward in waves, drawn by the promise of safety behind Rome's great river border. To them, Rome was no longer merely an adversary, it had become a potential lifeline. Some historians argue that this migration was the largest movement of people Rome had faced in centuries. Others suggest it was only the beginning of something much larger, a chain reaction triggered by the pressure of the Huns, as the Goths gathered at the Danube, waiting to be allowed into imperial lands. A quiet tension settled over the frontier. They were caught between a terror behind them and an uncertain welcome ahead. And little did either side know that this moment, this mass of refugees pressing against the Roman gates, would ignite a conflict that would shake the empire to its core, leading both the Goths and Rome into one of the most decisive turning points in ancient history. From the banks of the Danube, where thousands of Gothic families waited with fear tightening around their future, we now move into a chapter defined by desperation, betrayal, and the quiet spark that would one day ignite into full-blown rebellion. Sit back, relax, and picture the river at dawn mist drifting low across the water. Roman soldiers patrolling the opposite shore, and behind the Gothic lines the faint echo of distant hooves. A reminder that the Huns were still searching, still closing in. This was the moment when the Goths, driven not by ambition but by survival, begged for entry into Roman territory. Some historians believe Rome saw this as an opportunity. The Goths could be resettled, taxed, and even used as soldiers to bolster weakening legions. Others suggest that Rome simply underestimated the scale of the crisis, failing to recognize that this was not a band of raiders, but an entire migrating nation. Permission was granted, or at least partially granted. The Goths were allowed to cross, but only under strict conditions: surrender weapons, submit to census counts, and disperse into controlled settlements. Yet as the crossings began, things unraveled with chilling speed. Picture soldiers ferrying Gothic families across the river in small boats, overwhelmed by the sheer number of refugees pressing forward. Some groups were left stranded for days. Others were separated, families split by chaos. And once inside the empire, the situation grew darker. Roman officials, corrupt and careless, exploited the vulnerability of the newcomers. Food rations were withheld or sold at impossible prices. Some accounts speak of Gothic parents forced to trade their own children for scraps of meat. These were indignities the Goths never forgot. Their warriors, restrained by the memory of the Huns behind them and the hope of Roman safety ahead, simmered with a quiet fury. Tensions grew, fueled by hunger, humiliation, and the sense that Rome had broken its promise. Some researchers believe that Roman commanders intended to keep the Goths weak, fearing their numbers. Others suggest they simply lost control of a situation far larger than their administrative systems could handle. Meanwhile, Gothic leaders, among them the charismatic Fritigern, watched as their people suffered. They saw the betrayal, the cruelty, and the slow erosion of trust. And within their councils, a new thought began to surface. Perhaps the empire that had once seemed a refuge was instead becoming another trap. As months passed and conditions worsened, the Goths realized they could no longer wait for Roman justice. Something had to change. Something had to break. And soon, the breaking would come not through negotiation or diplomacy, but through the fire of rebellion that would reshape the fate of both the Goths and Rome forever. The year was 376 CE, and the simmering tension along the Danube had reached a dangerous pitch, a moment that would quietly, almost imperceptibly, tip the scales toward chaos. Imagine the scene: dense forests on either side of the river, the faint cry of birds echoing through misty mornings, and within the Gothic camps, a restless energy pulsing through the families, the warriors, the children too young to understand the weight of what was coming. Fritigorn, a figure both enigmatic and magnetic, moved among his people, his presence a quiet reassurance in a time of uncertainty. Some accounts describe him as a strategist, always thinking 3 steps ahead, while others portray him as a spiritual guide, someone who could read the despair in the eyes of those around him and turn it into resolve. The Romans, in their arrogance, assumed the Goths would remain compliant, subdued by hunger and displacement. They had no idea that within these wandering, fragmented communities, a new kind of leadership was emerging, one forged in hardship, betrayal, and the unyielding will to survive. Soldiers patrolled the perimeters of Gothic settlements, but their authority was tenuous at best. Some historians argue that Roman underestimation of Gothic unity was their fatal flaw. Others suggest that the empire's bureaucracy was simply too slow, too disconnected from the ground reality to grasp the growing storm. Meanwhile, the Gothic warriors trained in secret, their spears sharpened, their shields mended from whatever scraps could be found, listening to the soft whispers of their elders, tales of ancestral courage, of past migrations, of battles where the weak became strong. Food was scarce and fear was abundant, but in adversity, determination was forged. Some researchers believe that the Roman decision to allow the Goths to settle within imperial borders rather than keeping them at a controlled distance was intended as an act of mercy. Others suggest it was a calculated risk that went horribly wrong. By the late summer of 376, small skirmishes had already begun, incidents of theft, minor clashes with Roman guards, disputes over land allocations. Each confrontation, seemingly minor, added layers to the mounting resentment. From one campfire to the next, stories circulated of Roman cruelty and broken promises, the details morphing with each telling, yet the underlying truth remained. The Goths had been deceived. And in that deception, a spark ignited a spark that would grow into a flame so consuming that it would soon engulf the Roman legions themselves, forever altering the trajectory of the empire. As night fell over the Danube, the fog rolling in thicker than ever, one question lingered in the cold air. How long could the Goths endure before survival demanded a reckoning? The frost of winter approached in 377 CE, yet the Gothic camps along the Danube were far from the stillness one might imagine. There was a restless, almost electric energy beneath the surface, a quiet preparation for what some would later call inevitable. Fritigorn and his council moved among their people with a vigilance born of necessity, assessing the morale, the food stores, the readiness of their warriors. Every glance, every gesture, held weight in these tense days, for rumors had begun to seep through the Roman lines, rumors of soldiers' discontent, of overworked commanders, of vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Some scholars suggest that these whispers were the subtle threads of fate, weaving together a tapestry that neither side fully understood. The Romans, confident in their might and structured discipline, had stationed legions along the river, certain that the Goths, weary from flight and famine, would submit without major resistance. Yet, as the months progressed, It became increasingly clear that this was a miscalculation, a tragic underestimation of human resilience. The Goths, many of whom had fled from the Huns, carried with them not only the scars of past battles, but a profound knowledge of survival, of endurance in the face of cruelty. Fritigern, aware of both the fragility and the latent strength in his people, began to unify disparate groups, grew things and smaller bands into a single, cohesive force, bound less by formal hierarchy and more by shared grievances and shared hopes. Nightly councils were held under the cover of trees, the air thick with the scent of smoke and the quiet murmurs of strategy, while scouts moved silently along the riverbanks, noting patrol patterns, supply routes, and weaknesses in the Roman encampments. Some historians argue that this period of organization was the true turning point, the quiet before a storm that would soon erupt with unthinkable force. Others believe it was simply survival instinct, the natural response of a displaced people seeking security. In the stillness of the cold evenings, families huddled together, children clutching the hands of their parents, unaware of the magnitude of the events unfolding around them, unaware that their lives were on the cusp of intertwining with history in ways both tragic and transformative. And as the first snow dusted the edges of the Danube, the air seemed to carry a foreboding chill, a silent warning that the boundaries of empire and the destinies of men were about to collide. The question hung, heavy and unspoken, over every frozen tree and every murmuring campfire when the first clash came. Would it mark merely the survival of a people, or the beginning of a reckoning that would echo through centuries? The fateful summer of 378 CE dawned over a landscape poised between anticipation and dread, the air heavy with the scent of heat, dust, and distant pine, as both Romans and Goths prepared for confrontation along the rolling plains of Adrianople. The Roman Emperor Valens, determined to assert authority and quell what he saw as a precarious threat, moved his forces with confident precision, the clatter of armor and the rhythmic march of soldiers echoing like the drumbeat of destiny. He believed in the superiority of Rome's discipline, in the unyielding power of formations and legions hardened by centuries of conquest. Yet he failed to sense the subtle shifts in morale, the quiet glances exchanged among his generals that hinted at unease, the dissonance that comes when a leader underestimates the human element in war. Across the river, Fritigern and his Goths were a study in contrast. No polished armor, no coordinated drills, but a raw cohesion born of shared suffering and an instinct for survival sharpened by years of flight and fear. The camps hummed with a nervous energy, the low murmur of whispered strategy, the clink of weapons being checked and rechecked, the occasional shout from a scout returning with news of Roman positions. Some historians suggest that in those moments, the Goths' understanding of terrain and human unpredictability gave them an intangible advantage, a sense of rhythm and timing that could not be drilled into a legion. As the day wore on, the first skirmishes broke out, sudden and sharp, a clash of will against order, instinct against calculation. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of men and horses, dust rising in clouds that turned the sun into a dim, ghostly orb. Eyewitness accounts, fragmented and often contradictory, describe scenes of chaos punctuated by moments of eerie calm, of warriors pausing as if sensing the enormity of the moment, the shadow of history falling across them like an invisible hand. The battle swayed like a pendulum, victories claimed and lost within the span of heartbeats, the cries of the wounded mingling with the clash of steel. Some theorists argue that the outcome was inevitable, a consequence of arrogance meeting desperation, while others see it as a volatile balance tipped by chance, by decisions made in the fog of war that could have gone either way. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the bloodied plains in shades of gold and crimson, a question lingered over the scene, unspoken yet palpable. When the smoke cleared and the silence settled over age, what would remain of Rome's might, and what future would the Goths carve from the ruins of empire? The aftermath of Adrianople left an indelible mark on the Gothic psyche, a moment suspended between triumph and uncertainty, where the air itself seemed to hum with the memory of fire, steel, and the cries of men whose names would be forgotten, but whose presence lingered like shadows across the fields. Fritigorn, standing amidst the wreckage, could feel the weight of history pressing down, a burden not of victory alone, but of the knowledge that the world beyond the horizon was vast, uncertain, and waiting to test the resolve of his people. The Gothic warriors, once refugees fleeing famine, war, and Roman indifference, now carried with them the intoxicating awareness that they had struck the heart of the empire itself, that their actions had shifted the balance of power in ways that even the wisest scholars and generals could not fully comprehend. Some researchers believe that in this moment, a psychological transformation occurred among the Goths, a shift from being mere survivors to architects of a destiny intertwined with Rome's decline, their culture and leadership evolving rapidly under the pressures of newfound influence. Others suggest that the immediate years after Adrianople were not solely defined by ambition but by caution, as the Goths faced the logistical realities of sustaining their people, feeding families, and maintaining cohesion in the aftermath of battle, the tension between aspiration and necessity shaping every decision. Across the empire, rumors of the Gothic victory spread like wildfire, carried by merchants, travelers, and the few remaining Roman survivors, each retelling layering myth upon fact, exaggeration upon truth, until the battle became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a story whispered in imperial halls and rustic villages alike. The political ripples reached the very core of Rome, prompting debates, inquiries, and the slow, grinding reassessment of strategy and leadership, as the empire struggled to reconcile the illusion of invincibility with the reality laid bare on that sun-baked plain. Meanwhile, the Goths began to integrate into the wider Roman world, some settling as foederati, others pushing further into the empire, their presence a constant reminder of both vulnerability and opportunity. Settlements emerged, blending Gothic traditions with the remnants of Roman infrastructure, a delicate dance of adaptation and resistance. Yet beneath these movements lay an ever-present uncertainty. Would the Goths remain the elusive outsiders, the shadow at the edge of empire, or would they carve a permanent place within the Roman story, altering the trajectory of Europe in ways unseen, their legacy both feared and admired, lingering like a question that refused to be answered, waiting for the next chapter to unfold? As the Gothic presence deepened within Roman territories, the fragile equilibrium between conqueror and host created a landscape of tension, adaptation, and quiet intrigue. A world where every village, every town, seemed suspended between the familiar and the foreign, the old order and the new. Gothic leaders, aware of the fragile nature of their position, walked a delicate line, negotiating alliances, arranging settlements, and at times preparing for the inevitable conflicts that simmered beneath the surface. The air thick with anticipation and the ever-present hum of uncertainty. Some scholars argue that this period marked the beginning of a slow cultural fusion, where Gothic martial traditions, social structures, and religious beliefs began to interact with Roman law, customs, and governance, producing hybrid communities that were neither wholly Roman nor wholly Gothic, but something fluid, evolving, and unpredictable. Others suggest that the Goths remained fiercely distinct, preserving language, rituals, an identity with a vigilance born from centuries of displacement and survival, their camps and settlements echoing with songs, stories, and ceremonies that reinforced a sense of unity, even as the shadows of Rome loomed large. Across the empire, Roman officials and generals grappled with the challenge of controlling these new populations, balancing the benefits of Gothic military prowess against the fear of rebellion, the constant uncertainty of loyalty, and the haunting memory of Adrian, a wound in the empire's pride that refused to fade. Gothic settlements themselves became microcosms of negotiation, where elders, warriors, and families made decisions with subtlety and foresight, every choice carrying consequences that might ripple for generations. Trade routes, once dominated by Roman merchants, now saw Gothic participation, blending practical exchange with subtle assertion of influence, and even in the simplest axe-crafting tools, raising livestock, building homes, there was a sense of careful observation, of a people aware that their survival depended not just on strength, but on perception, diplomacy, and timing. Religion, too, became a quiet frontier of interaction, as Gothic beliefs, some still rooted in ancestral traditions, others influenced by Arian Christianity, intersected with Roman orthodoxy, producing theological tensions, philosophical debates, and at times, unexpected alliances that shaped both private life and political strategy. From one village to the next, from one court to another, the Goths left traces that were subtle yet indelible, shaping the social and cultural topography of the empire in ways that were only beginning to be understood. And yet, for all this activity, a question lingered like smoke on the horizon. Were the Goths simply adapting to survive? Or were they quietly laying the groundwork for a transformation of Europe itself? A future that would be written not in the grand halls of Rome, but in the quiet persistence, cunning, and ambition of those who had once been outsiders. By the mid-5th century, the Goths had become both architects and agents of a changing Europe, their movements, battles, and settlements reshaping borders, identities, and power structures in ways that would echo for centuries. The Visigoths, once wandering along the Danube and struggling for recognition, now commanded territories in Gaul and Hispania, regions rich in resources, culture, and ancient legacy, where Roman cities still stood as monuments to a fading empire. In these lands, Gothic kings exercised authority over diverse populations, ruling both Roman citizens and Gothic warriors, navigating the delicate balance between military power and civil administration, between old Roman law and Gothic custom. Some researchers emphasize the remarkable adaptability of Gothic rulers during this period, noting how they employed diplomacy, strategic marriages, and legal codification to maintain order and legitimacy, while others suggest that their rule was fragile, constantly tested by internal dissent, rebellion, and the ever-present threat of external invasion. Meanwhile, the Ostrogoths, having wandered eastward under pressure from the Huns, found themselves in the shadow of a crumbling Western Roman Empire, poised to carve their own dominion amidst the chaos. Their leaders, often former generals or chieftains of considerable skill, faced the complex task of integrating Roman administration, taxation, and urban life with the traditions and expectations of Gothic society, creating a hybrid governance that was part legacy, part innovation. Everyday life in Gothic-controlled territories was marked by contrasts. Roman villas still bore the traces of classical art and architecture, while Gothic fortifications, weapons, and warrior culture asserted a new order, and marketplaces hummed with the voices of multiple languages, accents, and trades, reflecting a Europe in transition. Religion remained a subtle yet potent force, with Arian Christianity distinguishing Gothic elites from the largely Nicene populations they governed, creating both tension and opportunity for influence. While some Gothic communities preserved pagan rituals or folk traditions, keeping ancestral memories alive beneath the surface of conversion and assimilation, across the continent, the Gothic presence was a quiet revolution, shaping the rhythms of war, diplomacy, and daily life, while leaving behind traces in law, language, and landscape that would outlast even the most powerful Roman monuments. And yet, even as kingdoms rose and borders shifted, a lingering question haunted chroniclers and citizens alike: could the Goths, once feared invaders, now rulers, truly forge a lasting legacy in a world still haunted by the ghosts of Rome's grandeur? Or would the tides of history wash their achievements into obscurity, leaving only whispers and ruins as testimony to their passage? As the 6th century dawned, the Gothic world faced new challenges and transformations, a period where ambition, betrayal, and resilience intertwined to shape their destiny. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric the Great reached its zenith, a striking blend of Roman sophistication and Gothic authority. Where palaces shimmered with mosaics, aqueducts still carried life-giving water, and the echo of Latin rhetoric mingled with the raw cadence of Gothic tongues. Theodoric, himself a man of both warrior lineage and cultivated intellect, sought to harmonize the two worlds, preserving Roman infrastructure and law while asserting Gothic sovereignty, a balancing act that few rulers could achieve. Some historians argue that his reign represented the high point of Gothic civilization, a rare moment where cultural fusion created stability, prosperity, and an aura of legitimacy that extended far beyond military conquest, while others suggest that beneath the grandeur lay fragile alliances, simmering resentments, and a population divided along ethnic and religious lines, where loyalty was never guaranteed. Across the Adriatic and into Hispania, Visigothic society also matured into something more than raiders and wanderers. As the Visigothic code codified laws, regulated property, and formalized relationships between rulers and subjects, producing a framework that would influence Iberian society for centuries. Yet, life for ordinary Gothic families remained uncertain, bound to the land through labor, war, and fealty, their fates often dictated by the ambitions of kings, generals, and the shifting currents of fortune. Religion, too, played a complex role. Arian Christianity, dominant among Gothic elites, coexisted uneasily with the Nicene faith of the conquered, prompting debates over conversion, tolerance, and identity, and leaving a legacy of spiritual tension that historians still puzzle over today. Meanwhile, rumors of Byzantine ambitions, internal rivalries, and opportunistic neighbors kept Gothic rulers vigilant, their diplomacy as sharp as their swords, their courts filled with intrigue, whispered plots, and shifting allegiances. Every fortress, city, and road became both a symbol of Gothic achievement and a reminder of their vulnerability, as empires and kingdoms beyond their borders watched, waited, and occasionally struck. And so, the Goths of this era walked a precarious path between triumph and decline, a civilization both proud and impermanent, leaving us to wonder, were they masters of their fate, shaping history with intention, or mere instruments of forces far larger than themselves, caught in a relentless tide that would eventually sweep even the mightiest rulers into the shadows of memory? The twilight of Gothic dominance began to take shape as the 6th century wore on, a time when ambition, external pressure, and internal fragility converged to test the limits of their kingdoms. In Italy, the Ostrogothic realm faced the relentless ambitions of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian I, whose desire to reclaim the lands of the fallen Western Roman Empire ignited a war that would stretch decades, leaving devastation in its wake. Cities once humming with trade and culture now echoed with the clang of siege engines, the cries of displaced families, and the creeping fear that centuries of Gothic achievement could be erased in a single campaign. Some chroniclers note that Theodoric's carefully crafted balance between Roman and Gothic elements could not survive his death, that his successors lacked his political acumen and personal authority, and that opportunistic generals and noble families further fractured unity. Across Hispania, the Visigoths faced their own trials, negotiating power and legitimacy in a region shaped by conquest, rebellion, and Roman heritage. Their kings wielded authority through councils and codes, yet succession disputes often turned deadly, with intrigue and betrayal undermining stability from within. A reminder that Gothic strength was always as fragile as the loyalty of those who swore fealty. Religion remained a silent yet pervasive force, shaping alliances, stoking tensions, and influencing the decisions of rulers and commoners alike. The gradual conversion of Visigoths from Arianism to Nicene Christianity signaled both adaptation and vulnerability, an acknowledgement that survival required compromise as much as conquest. Meanwhile, trade, migration, and cultural exchange brought both opportunity and uncertainty. Gothic artisans, soldiers, and families interacted with Romans and neighboring tribes, creating a complex tapestry of identity that was neither wholly Roman nor purely Gothic, a liminal existence that left historians pondering the true nature of their civilization. Battles were fought, treaties drafted, and borders redrawn, each event a marker of resilience and impending decline. And as the Gothic kingdoms weakened under relentless pressure, we glimpse a civilization at a crossroads, a people simultaneously magnificent and impermanent, whose legacy would ripple through Europe long after their swords fell silent. The question lingers, haunting and unanswerable, in the endless currents of history. Were the Goths architects of their fate, or were they swept along by tides far greater, their brilliance and brutality destined to fade like a dream at dawn? As the Ostrogoths and Visigoths struggled with internal strife and external pressures, the very landscape of Europe seemed to shift beneath their feet, mountains and rivers marking borders that were constantly in flux, and cities becoming prizes or graves depending on the luck of war. In Italy, the Gothic war with Byzantium dragged on for nearly 2 decades, leaving a scarred peninsula where once thriving towns turned into silent ruins, their stones whispering of ambition, fear, and the human cost of empire. Some historians suggest that disease, famine, and economic collapse were just as decisive as battles, that the slow, grinding attrition undermined Gothic morale and cohesion, leaving even their most loyal warriors weary and disheartened. Meanwhile, In Hispania, Visigothic kings faced the delicate balancing act of governing Romanized populations while maintaining their distinct Gothic identity. Councils of nobles debated laws and religious policy, but behind closed doors, intrigue and assassination plots simmered, a reminder that power was never secure and legitimacy was a fragile illusion. The process of conversion to Nicene Christianity further complicated matters, as clergy and monarchs negotiated authority in a way that intertwined faith with politics, offering unity but also opening fault lines for dissent. Trade networks, which had once brought wealth and connection, now became conduits for uncertainty, as Gothic merchants navigated shifting allegiances, piracy, and raids, and the rhythm of daily life, the sounds of marketplaces, the smell of hearth fires, the weight of armor on tired shoulders persisted even in the shadow of collapse. It is here, in these subtle human details, that we begin to see the full texture of Gothic existence, not merely a story of kings and battles, but of farmers, artisans, and soldiers who carried forward traditions, adapted to new rulers, and wrestled with survival in a world that seemed determined to erode their achievements. Some researchers argue that this period of turmoil, of rising and falling fortunes, planted the seeds of modern European identities, that Gothic laws, military practices, and cultural blending left traces that would echo long after their kingdoms dissolved. And yet, the deeper question remains, as the Gothic kingdoms fractured, did they vanish entirely, or do their shadows still linger in the customs, languages, and landscapes of the lands they once ruled? The answer is never simple, and perhaps it is in the uncertainty itself that the true fascination of the Gothic story endures, inviting us to lean closer, to listen for the faintest echoes of a people whose brilliance flickered like a candle against the dark sweep of history as the 7th century approached. The remnants of Gothic power were slowly folding into the emerging structures of medieval Europe, and yet their presence remained palpable in the architecture, law codes, and even the rhythms of daily life, whispering through the corridors of monasteries and the cobbled streets of towns that had once been their strongholds. In Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom wrestled with succession crises, noble rebellions, and the constant tension between maintaining Gothic traditions and integrating Roman and local Iberian practices, while the threat of external invasion loomed like a shadow, reminding rulers that stability was always temporary. Monks recorded histories and transcribed legal codes, preserving the Gothic legacy in scripts that would survive long after the political structures crumbled, their illuminated pages offering glimpses into a world of ceremony, strategy, and negotiation, where the line between faith and politics was blurred and the survival of memory became an act of subtle defiance. Across the Alps, in what had once been Italy, the Ostrogoths' attempts to sustain their dominion faltered against Byzantine reconquest, disease, and economic decay, leaving urban centers emptied of vitality, churches partially destroyed, and fields lying fallow, while surviving populations adapted to new rulers, absorbing elements of Gothic law, military expertise, and cultural practices into the evolving medieval framework. Some scholars suggest that Gothic military techniques, from cavalry formations to fortification strategies, continued to influence regional conflicts for generations, a ghostly echo of campaigns fought under banners now long forgotten. Meanwhile, the common people, artisans, farmers, and merchants navigated this uncertain landscape with pragmatism, marrying Gothic and local customs, trading in markets that had outlived kings, and celebrating festivals whose origins had been softened by centuries of adaptation, yet still carried a trace of their Germanic roots. Even language preserved fragments of Gothic identity, words and naming conventions threading through local dialects, subtle reminders that culture could survive where empires could not. And so, as the Visigothic and Ostrogothic kingdoms receded from the maps of rulers and chroniclers, their legacy lingered, not as a dramatic monument, but as a mosaic of influence woven into law, ritual, and memory. From one mystery to the next, we are left to wonder, in a Europe reshaped by conquest and conversion, how much of the Gothic spirit truly endured. Did it dissolve entirely, or did it flow quietly into the veins of the continent, shaping societies in ways invisible to the naked eye, yet undeniable to those who listen closely to the whispers of history? By the 8th century, the Goths, as a distinct political force, had largely vanished, yet their echoes persisted in surprising corners of Europe. From legal systems to architecture, from linguistic traces to cultural memory, leaving historians to piece together their lingering presence, like fragments of a shattered mirror reflecting a world both familiar and alien. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigothic Code, or Lex Visigoth, continued to shape law long after the last Gothic king fell to invading forces, influencing matters of inheritance, crime, and social obligation, blending Roman precision with Germanic tradition in a hybrid system that would endure under successive rulers, including Muslim and later Christian dominions. Some scholars argue that these legal frameworks were not mere relics, but active tools, guiding local governance and subtly preserving Gothic ideals of justice, hierarchy, and honor, even as new political realities unfolded around them. Meanwhile, in Italy, the remnants of Ostrogothic culture were absorbed by Byzantine administrators and local aristocracies, leaving subtle markers in city planning, fortifications, and the distribution of land, where Gothic military strategy and administrative acumen quietly informed decisions long after their armies had disbanded. Monastic communities became guardians of Gothic memory, copying texts, chronicling events, and embedding the Gothic past into the religious and intellectual life of Europe, transforming memory into both a spiritual and cultural currency. Artistic expression also bore traces of Gothic influence. Metalwork, jewelry, and carvings preserved distinctive motifs, angular lines, and symbolic designs, reflecting a worldview where power, spirituality, and the natural world were intertwined, even as the people who created them faded into the broader population. Some researchers believe that the Gothic identity lived on in the collective consciousness of European peoples, manifesting in folklore, heroic tales, and oral traditions that described warriors, kings, and migrations with a mixture of awe and apprehension, hinting at values and experiences that official histories often overlooked. And so, as centuries passed, the Gothic spirit became a shadow within the rising medieval tapestry, elusive yet present, tangible yet obscured, reminding us that disappearance in history is rarely complete. It whispers through legal codices, lingers in city walls, and hums in songs and legends, a spectral presence threading through the formation of nations and identities. From one enigma to the next, one must ask, can a people truly vanish when their influence is etched into the bones of a continent? Or do they endure, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the careful observer to uncover their traces in the layers of time? As we drift further into the remnants of Gothic legacy, one cannot ignore the subtle but profound impact they left on language and culture across Europe. A lingering resonance that hints at a civilization that refused to vanish entirely. The Gothic language, once spoken from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, gradually receded under the pressures of Latin, evolving vernaculars and shifting borders. Yet its traces survive in legal terms, place names, and ecclesiastical writings, preserved most famously in the Gothic Bible translated by Bishop Ulfilas, a work that stands as both a linguistic treasure and a testament to Gothic intellectual ambition. Some researchers suggest that this translation was not merely a religious undertaking, but also a cultural assertion, a deliberate effort to codify and transmit Gothic identity through the written word, offering the future a glimpse into their thought patterns, societal priorities, and worldview. Beyond language, Gothic architectural influence subtly permeated early medieval structures, especially in fortifications and ecclesiastical designs, where their approach to space, defense, and symbolic ornamentation can be detected in stone walls, arches, and mosaics across former Gothic territories. Even folklore absorbed their memory. Tales of wandering warriors, mystical kings, and heroic deeds echo motifs consistent with Gothic valor, reflecting values of courage, loyalty, and survival, which, over centuries, transformed into the mythic bedrock of European storytelling. Interestingly, genetic studies of populations in Italy, Spain, and parts of Eastern Europe suggest faint yet measurable markers of Gothic ancestry, hinting at a tangible, biological continuity that survives beyond texts, artifacts, and legends. This continuity raises intriguing questions. To what extent did the Goths merge into the societies they once dominated, and how much of their identity subtly persisted, shaping local customs, social structures, and even concepts of law and morality without explicit recognition? As we ponder these questions, the Goths emerge not as a simple historical footnote, but as a spectral presence threading through centuries, quietly influencing the evolution of Europe in ways both obvious and hidden. Their story reminds us that the end of a political entity is rarely the end of its influence, and that culture, memory, and identity can persist even when kingdoms crumble and armies disperse. So as we continue our journey, we move from the tangible remnants of Gothic life into the shadowy echoes that persist in collective consciousness, asking ourselves, where does history truly end, and where does its memory begin to linger, waiting to be rediscovered by those who dare to look deeper into the past? As the sun sets on the recorded history of the Goths, one cannot help but wander into the mysterious and often speculative realm of their final days as a distinct people, scattered across Europe, absorbed into emerging kingdoms, or fading quietly into obscurity. Some historians suggest that by the 8th century, the Gothic identity had largely dissolved into the broader populations of Spain, Italy, and Eastern Europe. Yet whispers of their presence remained in the form of localized customs, oral traditions, and lingering martial reputations that colored how these regions saw themselves and their neighbors. Archaeological evidence hints at this gradual blending. Settlements once distinctly Gothic show a fusion of material culture, pottery styles, and burial practices, indicating that assimilation was both voluntary and imposed, a slow negotiation between old traditions and new political realities. Others propose that the Goths never fully disappeared but rather transformed, influencing emerging feudal structures, legal codes, and aristocratic lineages. with certain Gothic families maintaining prominence for generations, quietly preserving a sense of inherited identity amidst changing rulers and shifting borders. Meanwhile, the Gothic ethos, their emphasis on personal honor, courage in battle, and loyalty to kinecode in military practices and the codes of chivalry that would later dominate European nobility, suggesting that even when people vanish as a distinct group, their values and cultural imprints can endure. Folklorists trace echoes of Gothic tales in epic poetry and sagas, with wandering heroes, doomed battles, and tragic kings that resonate with the narrative of a people constantly negotiating survival, power, and destiny. Linguistically, Gothic itself faded, but remnants survived in certain dialects and ecclesiastical texts, serving as cryptic reminders of a civilization that once spanned continents and wielded influence over empires. Some theorists even argue that Gothic memory influenced the development of national myths in later European states, embedding an unconscious Gothic presence into collective identity, law, and tradition. As night falls on this exploration, we are left to ponder the subtle persistence of a vanished people. The Goths may have ceased to exist politically, yet their spirit lingered, absorbed into the fabric of Europe in ways that are felt more than seen, recognized more in legacy than in living memory. And so, as we approach the final chapter of our journey, the question remains, can a people truly disappear when their echoes ripple through history, language, culture, and the very stories we tell ourselves about who we are? And now we arrive at the closing chapter of the Goths' sweeping saga, a reflection not just on what was lost, but on the haunting traces that remain, like footprints pressed into the soft soil of history, never quite erased. As centuries unfolded, the Gothic legacy became a silent undercurrent, shaping the lands they once ruled, the peoples they touched, and the imagination of those who would write history long after their time had passed. In Spain, the Visigothic legal codes survived as templates for later medieval law, their emphasis on justice, property, and social hierarchy subtly guiding centuries of governance and order. In Italy, Gothic military techniques and fortification strategies informed the rise and fall of city-states, the echoes of their sieges and campaigns still whispering through the stone walls and crumbling battlements. Even in the north, among the Ostrogoths, fragments of their culture mingled with the emerging Slavic and Byzantine worlds, leaving glimpses of Gothic artistry in mosaics, weaponry, and ceremonial relics. Some scholars suggest that Gothic identity survived in memory, in the oral histories passed down by storytellers who wove cautionary tales of exile, conquest, and resilience. Narratives that would later influence medieval romances, epics, and perhaps even the modern fascination with the barbarian past. Language, too, held its secrets. Though Gothic speech faded from everyday use, traces survived in ecclesiastical texts, cryptic inscriptions, and borrowed vocabulary, each syllable a faint echo of a civilization that once commanded vast regions and swayed the course of empires. And yet the Goths' greatest legacy may lie not in artifacts or laws, but in the imagination itself, a reminder that a people's spirit can outlast borders, armies, and dynasties, living on in myth, in literature, in the shadows of history that invite us to explore, question, and wonder. As we sit back and let the story sink in, there is a peculiar serenity in this reflection. The Goths, once feared warriors and architects of kingdoms, have transformed into something more ethereal, an idea as much as a people, a narrative of survival, transformation, and the mysterious ways in which history remembers. And so, with the final echoes of their footsteps fading into the twilight of our minds. We are left to ask ourselves, what does it mean for a people to vanish? If their influence, their ideals, and their stories persist quietly, shaping the world in ways unseen, yet undeniably felt, the Goths may no longer walk among us, but their legacy endures, whispered in the winds of time. A testament to a civilization that once roared across continents and now whispers in the corridors of history, inviting us to listen, to imagine, and to remember.